Hello. This week's topic is criminal justice policy. Please read the assigned chapter before beginning the written assignment. But I wanted to talk for just a couple of minutes about this topic. So here we're talking about how how we in the United States deal with crime, how we try to prevent it, and how we punish it when it occurs. Now, one thing you should understand is that for the most part, crime is handled at the state and local level in this country. And that's because when you're dealing with crime, you're dealing with the alleged violation of a law, and most of the laws we live under in this country are passed at the state and local level. There aren't that many federal crimes. Now, certainly when someone commits a federal crime, it's very much in the news, but almost all law enforcement occurs at the state and local level. Now, each state has its own rules for how it handles crimes. It also has its own punishments for violations of the law. So, for example, in some states, the ultimate punishment for murder is the death penalty, which is known as capital punishment. And in other states, which would include Michigan, there is no state-sanctioned death penalty. I should mention, with regard to capital punishment, that a growing number of states have either abolished that punishment for crimes or have stopped enforcing that punishment. And that's because there have been a lot of instances in recent years where people were sentenced to death for a crime, and DNA evidence later proved that that person did not commit the crime. And unlike other punishments, which can be reversed if it turns out the government made a mistake, there's obviously no reversal with regard to the death penalty. And there also there are a lot of people who would argue that capital punishment constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Constitution, although the Supreme Court does allow states to use the death penalty if they so choose. But again, Michigan and a number of other states do not have a death penalty. But for other crimes and for other issues, each state pretty much sets its own punishment. I should mention that in the 1960s, and this is discussed in the chapter, in the 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court extended the provisions of the Bill of Rights to the states through the 14th Amendment. So all of the due process provisions, or most of them, those would include things like the right to a lawyer in a criminal case, protection against double jeopardy, meaning that you can't be tried twice for the same crime, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures in your home. All of those rights and many others have been incorporated into the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which means that those rights can now be applied to the states. So that at the state level today, a criminal defendant in a major case does have the right to a lawyer. So if he or she cannot afford one, the government provides one for them. Of course, many people are familiar with the case of Miranda versus Arizona back in the 1960s, and that's the case where the Supreme Court ruled that criminal defendants must be informed of their constitutional rights before they are interrogated. Now, with regard to the punishment for crime, certainly there are different schools of thought about how we should approach crime. Certainly some would argue that criminal defendants should be thrown in the book. Others would argue that some crimes are different than others and that we should be careful about how we handle them. For example, there are some crimes that would be regarded as victimless, meaning that there's no specific victim of the crime, but the person has broken the law. An example of that would be the use of illegal drugs. Now, one could argue that drug dealers have a lot of victims and so forth, but the use of drugs directly impacts the person using them, but may not impact anybody else if the person doesn't commit any other crimes while they're on the drugs. And so a lot of people have argued that instead of punishing people for using drugs, that there should be alternative sentencing arrangements, maybe drug courts and rehabilitation type of situations, and that possibly that some drugs could be legalized or decriminalized. Certainly, we've seen an increasing move to do that with regard to marijuana. A number of states have legalized it for recreational purposes. The state of Michigan has not legalized it for recreational purposes as of 2017. However, Michigan, a number of years ago, the voters of Michigan did decriminalize marijuana for medical purposes. And certainly there's a growing move on the part of states to eliminate any criminal penalties for the use of marijuana. The argument being that it's no worse in terms of addiction and so forth than alcohol, which results in a lot more people dying. So in any event, that would be one way to deal with that, is to just decriminalize it, because a lot of people end up in jail or prison for the use of different drugs. So you could either rehabilitate them through drug court situations where they go to a rehab facility and deal with the addiction, or in the case of maybe kind of drugs that are not as serious, you could reduce the penalties for using them or eliminate them altogether. But of course, there are lots of debates about whether that's wise or not. You could also tax the drugs, which is another argument for doing that. With regard to other issues of crime, a lot of times the media would suggest that we are experiencing higher rates of crime in this country. But the reality is that in recent years, crime rates have actually declined or have been at lower levels. There have been periods, certainly years, where the crime rate has gone up, and then other years where it's been down. But certainly crime rates today are much lower than they were in years ago. And that's for various reasons. There was a bill back in the 1990s to put more police on the streets, and there have been other measures to deal with crime. Certainly crime is a condition, when somebody commits a crime, it's a condition of their social circumstances oftentimes. And so when we do more to deal with things like poverty and hunger and so forth, and unemployment and mental health, we can deal with crime rates proactively. But the reality is people do commit crimes, and the government has to decide how to deal with that. I'd ask that you look through some of the ideas that are discussed, the front door strategies and the back door strategies. Back door strategy would be to release nonviolent criminals early if they've behaved well in prison. Front door strategies would be to look at things like reducing the penalties for victimless crimes, and so that we put fewer people in prison. One other thing that we should look at, certainly in this country, is the issue of racial disparities in how we handle crime, and the disproportionate number of African American men who get sent to prison versus white men and others, and whether there are issues that we need to look at in terms of why that happens, because it is certainly not the case that African Americans are more likely to commit crimes. That is a fallacy. Most crimes are committed actually by white men and white people, but we do see a large number of African American men in prison, and that's something that we as a society really need to look at. So, at any rate, I hope you read the chapter carefully. There's a lot of good information in it, and particularly with regard to how we collect data on crime and ideas on how to deal with it, and then answer the written question. If you have any questions, please contact me, and have a great week.